I am Peter Bowman, the President of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to those in our in-person audience and those also on our online audience to this second William and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point Series event. Bill and Pat were longtime supporters of the Council and the work that we do. And Pat served as a director in the early 2000s when we had a critical time in the organization, and she helped navigate us through that period. We are deeply grateful to the entire Ayers family for their generous support in helping to create a sustainable future for the Council. Our other sponsors of this evening's event are the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association and what I call our existentially important mission sponsor, Southern New Hampshire University. For those unfamiliar with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, we are a non-profit organization supported financially by memberships, program fees, grants, donations, and sponsorships from both individuals and businesses. If not already a member or a donor, we would certainly want to incorporate you into those categories, so you can talk with any of our staff, any of our board members, or go to our website, wacnh.org, to find out how you can be part of our journey forward. We are a platform for discussion, and we take no positions on policy, politics, parties, candidates, and such. The views expressed tonight are those of our speaker, not the Council, its board, staff, sponsors, donors, or members. We have fostered learning, discussion, and involvement in world affairs for almost 70 years. We were started in 1954. We help create and sustain international connections that enhance our state's cultural, economic, and civic life. We build global knowledge and understanding through our educational programs for communities and schools on the subject of foreign policy. We help develop international leaders in partnership with the U.S. Department of State, which has been called as soft power, which is a very powerful program. And finally, we strongly believe that an informed public is a bedrock principle of a working democracy. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, Bill DeVries of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association would like to make a few remarks. Bill.
Thanks very much. As said, I'm Bill DeVries. I'm president of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association, which is a co-sponsor of this series. The Fulbright Association is a non-profit organization constituted to support the Fulbright program, which is itself the educational exchange program of the United States Department of State. The Fulbright program operates as a partnership between the United States and the local governments in over 160 countries, with funding coming from both the U.S. and the foreign government. It is an exchange program so that there are roughly equal numbers of Americans going abroad and foreign citizens coming to the U.S. There are a variety of different kinds of Fulbright grant opportunity. Grants to conduct independent study abroad, grants to pursue research, a degree, or a certificate at a foreign university, grants to teach English in the elementary or secondary schools abroad, grants to teach at foreign universities, grants for civil servants and other citizens with special expertise to learn how other places work and to teach how we do things. Grantees are often young and just beginning to build a career, but there are many senior Fulbright Fellows as well. I want to encourage everyone here, both students, faculty, but also staff and other citizens, to look into the program and to see whether there is something there that would enrich your life or advance your career. Participating in the Fulbright program is a life-changing experience, and that I can say on personal experience. Closer to home, the Fulbright Association is an organization of the alumni and friends of the Fulbright program, and we seek to orchestrate interesting and educational experiences for Fulbright alumni, to support the Fulbright scholars who have come to New Hampshire to visit from abroad, and to engage in activities, some a little bit of politicking, that aim basically to keep the Fulbright program strong. We believe that the kind of outreach embodied in the Fulbright program is an essential and a vital part of American diplomacy. So I would invite you to help us join in supporting this important program. If you've got some interest, if you want to participate in our programs or help us support the Fulbright program, let me know. You can track us down on the web, of course, at fulbright.org. Thanks very much.
I will now introduce this evening's speaker. Dr. Katrina Burgess is an associate professor of political economy and director of the Henry J. Lear Institute for Migration and Human Security at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Courting Migrants, How States Make Diasporas and Diasporas Make States, and the second book, Parties and Unions in the New Global Economy. She has published numerous articles on labor politics, remittances, migration, and diasporas, including a recent article in the publication Electoral Studies with Michael Taberski on political party outreach to voters abroad. In 2019, she wrote and produced Waylaid in Tijuana, a documentary about Haitian and Central American migrants whose journeys to the United States are disrupted by shifts in U.S. policy. Her current research addresses how migrants traveling north through Mexico assess risk and process information regarding their prospects for entering the U.S. And secondly, the impact of the restrictionist immigration policies on U.S.-Mexico border communities. Before coming to Fletcher, she taught at Brown and Syracuse universities, UCLA, and ITAM, the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico. She received her PhD in politics from Princeton University. Dr. Burgess's talk this evening is entitled, The Future of Democratization in the Northern Triangle. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I also want to thank the World Affairs Council, the Fulbright Association, and Southern New Hampshire University. This is my first time here. It's a really lovely campus. And so I'm very pleased to be here, even though I did have to suffer through Boston traffic to get here, but it wasn't too bad. So today I'm going to talk about a region that you can tell from my bio is close to my heart. I've been working on Latin America for a long time. I've spent quite a bit of time in Mexico in particular, and I teach several classes on Latin American politics and migration in the Americas. Today I want to focus on patterns of regime change and transition in a particular part of the Americas focused on Mexico and Central America. And sadly, I'm going to tell kind of a not a happy story for the most part. It was once a happy story. There was a sort of transition to democracy across the region in the 1980s and 1990s, but recently we've seen reversals, hence the title of my talk, which is, or my slightly revised title, which is Democratic Reversals in Mexico and Central America. So to start, what I'd like to do, if this works, there we go, is to give you a bit of an overview, very quickly, of the history of democratization in the region. And what you can see from, hopefully you can see this, it's a little small, but what it is, it's a chronological accounting essentially of the most recent democratic transition throughout the region of Latin America. And you can see sort of 2 waves. The first wave in the mid-20th century, which included Costa Rica, Colombia, and Venezuela, happened in about a 10-year period. After the Second World War, sort of the beginning of the Cold War, the context of the Cold War, and then came to a kind of abrupt end in the late 1950s. Not coincidentally, right before the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Those for most of the 60s and 70s, those countries were the only countries that maintained a democratic system of government consistently until more recent years. Other countries were going back and forth. You then see a big wave in the 1980s and the 1990s, and into the early 2000s, the early 21st century, and that's the rest of the countries. And this was in the context of a serious economic transformation in the region, a major economic crisis in the early 1980s, and then a fundamental reconfiguration of the role of the state in these economies in the context of globalization. This also happened in the context of the end of the Cold War, which had a really transformative impact on politics in Latin America, partly because Latin America has always been in the shadow of the United States, and the United States, as one of the major protagonists in the Cold War, sort of reflected those politics in its relations with countries south of the US border. So you have this big shift toward democratization in a lot of countries in Latin America, and by the end of the 1990s, really by the turn of the 21st century, almost all countries in the region were considered democratic. Different qualities of democracy, right? Some were better democracies than others, but with very few exceptions, the countries in the region were democratic. So this seemed to be a very positive story, and I think it was in many ways. However, as I mentioned, unfortunately, we're seeing a reversal of that pattern in quite a number of countries, which is what I'm going to focus on today. So I want to talk a little bit about why democracies have come under stress in these countries, and then some updates on what that looks like in a few specific places. One thing that I also wanted to mention, one thing you may notice here, is there's a lot of notes that say failed coup, attempted coup, short-lived coup. One thing that's really changed throughout the world, at least until recently, is that democracies don't die by coup the way they used to, right? The main reason that democracies failed in Latin America historically was that there was a coup, that the military would take power, seize power, kick the civilians out of office, and then maintain power. These coups tended to be either they didn't succeed, or they lasted a very short time, and then basically power was handed to a different civilian leader, and who then held elections. And so it was kind of like a restoration, a blip away from democracy, but not a full regime transition. And then in the other direction, the way countries become authoritarian has changed as well. It's rather than coups, it tends to be a gradual infringement on democratic rights, a gradual weakening of democratic institutions, often in the midst of regular elections. So Venezuela is sort of a classic example of this. So it's hard to say exactly when a country went from being democratic to being authoritarian. When it happens like this, rather than because the military comes in with guns and kicks the civilians out of office. So I want to share that as kind of context for how regimes change and how sort of these shifts from authoritarian to democracy and from democracy to authoritarian are happening in the contemporary period. So what this slide shows is what has happened to these democracies recently. And so the color coding is based on a ranking that's done by Freedom House, which characterizes countries by regime type along three dimensions. Free, which is the green, partly free, which is the yellow, and not free, which is the purple. And then I have the same list of countries in the chronological order of their last democratic transition. And as you can see, there's some green, but there's a lot of yellow and purple. Purple, the three countries that were previously democratic, that are now clearly not, are Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti. Right? They are clearly no longer democracies and have made pretty significant transitions toward authoritarian rule. The countries that are yellow are kind of in transition. It's not entirely clear whether they're democratic or if they've become authoritarian. And I'm going to talk more about those countries because one thing that you'll note is that if you focus on Mexico and Central America, Belize is sort of this odd outlier, right? That's their little green country. But everything else, and then Costa Rica and Panama, are still solidly democratic, but the rest of the region is having serious issues with democracy. Nicaragua is an authoritarian regime at this point, and then all the other countries in the Central American regions are very highly problematic when it comes to democracy, particularly Mexico and what's known as the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Those three countries are what are called the Northern Triangle, and those are the countries I'm going to focus on, plus Nicaragua and Mexico, in this talk. And so you can see that all is not well on the democracy front, particularly in these countries. So I want to explain a little bit about why that might be the case. So I think a lot of the answer comes from the context in which these countries not only democratized, but tried to maintain democratic forms of government. And I'm going to look at 4 converging contextual factors that have made it very difficult. So 4 converging challenges that countries, particularly Mexico and Central America, have faced in the last 20 years or so. So persistent poverty and underemployment and inequality is one. The war on drugs is another, and sort of what happened to that in terms of shifts in the location of different aspects of narco production and transport. The third is an explosion of violence, and these are all interconnected, right? And then the fourth one is the very high levels of corruption and collusion between state officials and non-state, violent or corrupt non-state actors. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. So first of all, the economic front. The 1980s, which is when a lot of these countries at least were starting to democratize, was a very rough decade for Latin America. It was the period of what was then known as the Third World Debt Crisis. Started in Mexico, where Mexico had taken out very large amounts of foreign debt in the 1970s. Mexico is also an oil producer. And so 2 things happened in the early 1980s that made it impossible for Mexico to service its debt. One, the US raised interest rates, and these debts were owed in dollars. And 2, the price of oil collapsed. This was in 1982. And so Mexico had to go to the IMF and the US Treasury and say, help, we can't service our debt, we need to be bailed out. What did that do in terms of the lenders? It was a red flag. Uh-oh, these are not credit-worthy countries, and it spread throughout the region. And so a lot of countries in Latin America had taken out a lot of debt, commercial debt mostly, in the 1970s and early 1980s, suddenly couldn't pay their bills, had to be bailed out. And as part of the terms of that bailout, they had to adopt what's known as structural adjustment. So very harsh economic reforms that then contributed to weakened social safety nets, as well as declining real incomes in these countries. So people were poorer, and they had less access to healthcare, education, to the degree that these governments were providing these things. They were less able to provide them because they had less money, and they were under pressure to reduce the role of the state in the economy, but there wasn't sort of compensation through private provision of these kinds of essential services and goods. So poverty and underemployment, sometimes unemployment, almost always unemployment, got worse during this period. Inequality tended to get worse. And even since the lost decade of the 1980s was over, it ended a while ago, countries in the region have either had slow growth or very volatile growth. Like they'll grow really quickly one year and then have an economic crisis and have negative growth the next year. And so it's very, very volatile, which takes a toll on businesses, it takes a toll on consumers, it takes a toll on workers, right? And then you also have the persistent inequality. So an inability or an unwillingness to distribute the proceeds of growth broadly across the population. And so you have these pockets of poverty and people who have trouble feeding their families based on, certainly on one job, never mind multiple jobs. And so one of the reactions is people migrate and send remittances. And this chart on the right, I'm sorry it's hard to see, but what it's showing is the share of GDP represented by remittances, which are monies that migrants send back to their families to help them out. And so in Honduras and El Salvador, remittances represent over almost 30% of the gross domestic product. So it's hugely important to their economies. In Guatemala and Nicaragua, it's over 15%, right? In Mexico, it's a lot lower, it's about 4%, but they receive, in 2021, they received around $52 billion in remittances, which is small relative to their large economy, but very important for households and communities. So there's sort of this reliance on this external source of money, but at the same time reflects an unwillingness or an inability of their own governments to provide for them. And so one of the things that research has shown that this does is that people just sort of withdraw politically, and they become disengaged from democratic politics. And that actually provides more space for less democratic actors to have their way and to encroach on democratic institutions. So that's one context that's really important for understanding politics in this region. A second one is what happened with the so-called war on drugs, which really took off, if you will, in the 1980s as well, sort of the same period as the lost decade. The US decided to become much more aggressive in trying to crack down, particularly on the supply and the transport of narcotics. And what that did, one of the things it did, is it pushed routes. The crackdown happened primarily in the Caribbean, which was where a lot of the drugs were coming from South America, particularly cocaine, and being transported through the Caribbean into the United States. They cracked down on the Caribbean. Well, what happens with drug trade is it's like a balloon. You squeeze one place and it pops out in the other place. So where it popped out was Central America and Mexico. And it shifted westward. And these are some images. Again, it's a little bit small, but to show you on the left is the evolution of aerial trafficking routes in Central America from 2016 to 2020. And you can see there's been actually some diversification back toward the Caribbean, but without reducing the amount of these flights that are going through Central America. And then the figure on the right is all drug trafficking routes focused on cocaine. And you can see there are maritime routes, there are aerial routes, there are land routes. And so these illicit substances are being transported through these countries. And every stop, there's a payoff. There's often some corrupt official who's allowing it to pass through. And at the same time, there's often pressure from the US to eradicate the crops or to crack down on the drug lords, put them in jail. So funding going into law enforcement, into militaries, et cetera. So it creates a kind of environment in which violence and corruption is much better able to take root, right? There's so many temptations when there's the very active drug trade, especially in places that have historically had weak institutions, have had weak rule of law. And so I would argue this is one of the main reasons why democracy is so fragile in these particular countries, is because the consequences of this shift many years ago that has become entrenched, right? That this industry is very much entrenched in this region. And another thing I'll just point out about the figure on the right, which you probably can't see very well, but there's sort of that yellowish green in Honduras. And those indicate processing plants, basically. So Honduras is not only a country of transit, but it's also become a place where where cocaine is processed, right? Which creates a whole other political economy of narcotics with associated violence and collusion that goes with it. And so it's not surprising that Honduras has become one of the most violent countries in the world, if not in the region. And that's where I want to turn next. So largely, although not entirely sparked by the enormous role that the narcotics trade has played since the 1980s in this whole region, is you just have this explosion of violence. And so in Mexico, what really sparked it was that the Mexican government decided to take on the drug cartels. There's been drug trafficking in Mexico since the 19th century. It's nothing new. And there's been collusion and corruption since, for many, many decades as well. But with democratization, the state actually had less control over it, right? It became decentralized, and it became more competitive. And so the drug traffickers were becoming increasingly powerful, and a particular administration in Mexico decided to take this on. And what ended up happening is it unleashed a drug war within Mexico, where you have rival cartels fighting the state directly, fighting each other, and Mexico became a much more dangerous place in the early 2000s. It started with an economic crisis in the late 1980s, 1990s, but it really has become dangerous since the turn of the 21st century. And I started going to Mexico in the late 80s, and it was a very safe country. And now it's a very unsafe country. So this has just had a dramatic effect on life in Mexico, but particularly for the purposes of our conversation today, on politics of Mexico, right? Because you can imagine what high levels of violence do to governance, do the ability for a democracy to function, right? So that's kind of what's happened in Mexico. And then in the Northern Triangle in particular, two of these countries, Guatemala and El Salvador, had civil wars, very bloody civil wars. There were different lengths, but they were most intense in the 1980s. Then they had peace accords in the early 1990s, which led to the transition to democracy. But there are legacies left by civil wars, right? Low levels of trust, lots of guns around. And when that intersected with drug trafficking, plus the deportation of gang members from Los Angeles back to El Salvador, it was like a perfect storm to create a much more violent context. And so you have a brief period of peace and democracy, but then it falls into this pattern of gang violence, and then a so-called mano dura response on the part of the state, which is translates as iron fist. So the response of the governments in these regions was to crack down on these actors, to throw them in jail, to kill them, including extrajudicially. And this, many would argue that this sort of contributed to this spiral of violence, right? It's challenging, what do you do in that situation as a government when there's a high levels of criminality? But I think there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that a uncompromising crackdown, especially when you're talking about young people, which most of these gang members are, it doesn't tend to end well, right? There may be better ways to handle these kinds of situations, but that was the reaction in these countries. And so that contributes to an explosion of violence. And then all of this has in recent years, really since 2014 or so, contributed to what we hear about in the newspapers, which is many more Central Americans arriving at the US-Mexico border, trying to get to the United States. And then you add Venezuelans who are also being forcibly displaced. So the levels of forced displacement are unseen, I think, in the Americas. Migration used to be mostly labor migration, people coming to send remittances to support their families. Now it's much more heavily forced migration, where people are fleeing violence or fleeing abuse and harassment and extortion, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So this is also one of the consequences of this increasingly violent context. And then if I remove the circle, you can see again, if you look up in the upper left corner, that's Mexico and Central America. And that's where the highest homicide rates are concentrated. They don't map precisely onto the countries with the most fragile democracies, but there's sort of a rough correlation, right, between high levels of violence and low quality of democracy, if there's democracy at all. And just to put this in perspective, so Honduras in 2021, according to these statistics, had a homicide rate of 38.6 per 100,000 people. The rate in the United States is 6.5 in the same year. So just to put it in perspective, these are very high homicide rates. They're much higher than anywhere else in the world, almost anywhere else in the world. The other thing that characterizes these countries is very high rates of femicide. El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala have some of the highest rates of killing of girls and women in the world as well. So they're very violent places, and this has political consequences. And I think it has contributed to the fragility of democratic systems of government, sort of created a vicious circle in that respect. So the last converging challenge that I want to talk about just briefly is corruption and collusion, which I've already mentioned, right? That this environment is sort of ripe for corruption, but also for collusion between corrupt state officials and kind of bad actors outside the state, be they criminal, drug organizations or gangs or other kinds of bad actors. And you see this across the region of Mexico and Central America. So in Mexico, the Northern Triangle, you have a degree of basically state capture by criminal elements. So criminal elements are so embedded with the government that the government loses its autonomy, its ability to govern independently of these criminal organizations, and they become very indebted to them for campaign financing, for their own personal sort of wealth, etc. The other problem is that the violence really affects elections, for example. The numbers of political killings in these countries is really high. People running for mayor get shot down in the street. It's not an unusual occurrence. Journalists are incredibly at risk in these countries, and that has implications for democracy, right? Mexico has very high rate of journalists being killed. It's one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist in the world, and that has implications for a well-functioning democracy as well. In Nicaragua, it's a little bit different. Nicaragua has been a little bit out. It's changed. But initially, they weren't quite on the path for the drug traffickers, plus having a sort of different political history. So they haven't had the high levels of violence that some of their neighbors have had, but the regime has become increasingly repressive and corrupt. And the current president, Daniel Ortega, whose picture you saw on the initial slide, was the leader of the Sandinista revolution in 1979, which was a leftist revolution. And he was sort of the hero of a successful revolution, despite the very heavy US influence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He came back after the transition to democracy, won a free and fair election for president, and has since colluded with, here I put it, corrupt rivals to maintain his power. And now he's just kind of a typical strongman in Latin America who's consolidated his power and relied on repressive tactics to maintain it. And so it's a very repressive regime. And then the final point here is that extortion has kind of become the crime of choice in Latin America, and it's very widespread. And just to read you some statistics, which are pretty mind-blowing. According to one study, the extortion industry in the Northern Triangle, so this doesn't even include Mexico, the 3 countries in the Northern Triangle, is worth at least $1.1 billion annually, according to this study. And it's carried, over 300,000 people a year experience extortion, or are subject to extortion. And extortion is basically a kind of taxation, but it's usually by non-state actors. And if you don't pay up, you may die, right? The price of not paying up is pretty severe. And there are also state actors who engage in this, right? Who extort more than regular taxation from their citizens. And so and this chart, which you can't really see, but I put it up here just to show how complex the system is. It's a whole system. It's a whole political economy, right? Built on this, the extortion. And it creates danger and fear for people in their everyday lives. And this is in working with and interviewing asylum seekers on the US-Mexico border. This is something you hear over and over again. It was the extortion. It was the extortion. I had to leave. They were going to. I couldn't keep paying. They were going to kill me. It's something you hear over and over again, and it's not surprising given how massive this problem is in Latin America. And unfortunately, the authorities who are supposed to be dealing with this are often involved, right? They're complicit through the collusion in this industry. So they're not going to crack down on it because they're benefiting. So it's very complex and quite depressing, but further undermines sort of the democratic institutions and the ability of democratic institutions to deliver what they promise and to function properly. So my last slide is going to take a little bit of a look at that in a few places. and I'll be brief because I want to leave time for questions. So in Mexico, what we've seen in the last few years is essentially a return to the one-party hegemony that characterized Mexico from 1929 until the year 2000, where there was one party. There were elections, there were other parties, but one party basically controlled everything. We've seen a return to that under Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's known as AMLO, and his party Morena, which was a new party, but it's kind of a patchwork of people from old parties. And he won a landslide victory in 2018, partly because people were so fed up with the level of crime and the problems with the economy, et cetera. And now his party dominates pretty much every branch of government, every level of government. So Mexico's a federal system like the US, so they have state governments and local governments. Pretty much all of them are controlled by AMLO's party. And he has also narrowed the space for independent intellectuals and non-governmental organizations. He's also been unable to control the violence, which is one thing that he promised. And so there continue to be the killings of political candidates. So since he took office, an estimated 60 local government officials have been killed, including 18 mayors. So despite all his promises and the centralization of power in Mexico, the violence continues, and he's not been able to handle it. In El Salvador, the president's name is Nayib Bukele, who, like AMLO, kind of had a sort of populist message. He's presented himself as an alternative to the same old politicians and the same old parties. He won in a landslide victory in 2019, and his party, which is now called Nuevas Ideas, similarly dominates all branches of government and all levels of government, and he's actually undertake actions to limit the independence of the judicial system and also controls the legislature. And he has recently announced that he's planning what is essentially an unconstitutional run for re-election in 2024. The Constitution says you can't run for re-election, and he's trying to fudge it so that he's going to run for re-election. He also, in March, declared a state of emergency in response to kind of a wave of gang-related violence. And what that has done is essentially empowered the state authorities to arbitrarily detain people. And human rights organizations have been very adamant about how terrible this is. And I've heard specific individual cases of people's family members being swept up in this sort of trying to get all the gang members in jail. People who had nothing to do with gangs, who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or happened to have a tattoo, or other reasons why they would be swept up. And so it's again, inimical to a democratic kind of governance. Guatemala and Nicaragua, it's more straightforward. It's basically ruled by repression. Guatemala has recently cracked down on anti-corruption judges and prosecutors, which did exist, but they've essentially been either had legal cases against them that are probably bogus, but are useful for disempowering them, or outright death threats, harassment. Many of them have fled and are in exile. Human rights defenders are also very vulnerable in Guatemala, and similarly in Nicaragua. And then finally, Honduras is a kind of slight glimmer of hope. So there was a coup in 2009. The regime, the government that took over after the coup, there were several administrations. The most recent one was actually indicted in a court in New York for narco trafficking, for being in cahoots with drug traffickers. And so it was a narcotics financed, repressive, authoritarian government, essentially, but they still held elections. And in the 2021 election, his party lost, and a new president won, who so far, one of the most interesting developments, and I'll close here, is that her government is in negotiations with the UN about establishing a special anti-corruption commission, which used to exist in Guatemala, and then the government disbanded it. But they're talking of maybe setting up something similar in Honduras. It's too early to tell whether she'll survive. I mean, she faces very powerful opposition in a country that has really deep problems. But it's a little ray of hope, right? That she was able to win, she was able to take office, and seems to be able to do at least talk a certain talk, and hopefully she can actually make some changes happen. But it's pretty fragile. So I'll close there, and I really look forward to your questions.
You probably need to turn that on.
That, okay. You've done a great job of outlining the problems and making a lot of them seem insurmountable. I know that the Biden administration has proposed to spend about $4 billion on trying to address issues, fundamental issues in Central America. What would you do with that money?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because unfortunately, the change that needs to happen is not change that's easy to make, right? These are very deep, long-standing challenges. And also, I think what we've learned everywhere in the world is that institutional change is really hard. Creating jobs is maybe not so hard, but so this more sort of fundamental institutional change so that there is accountability, that institutions function properly, that there's rule of law. It's really hard to do. So I'll start with that, and then I'll say I think one thing that can be helpful, and I think the US government has done this, is to support local organizations that are doing really good work, right? And especially at the local level, because I think that's where it has to start. There needs to be change at the national level, certainly, but if we can sort of create pockets of innovation and sort of creative solutions at the more local level and create some kind of hope, because one of the things I really see in this region is a loss of hope, and I think that also promotes migration. When people feel like, why stay? I don't want to leave. This is my home. But this is just a lost cause. And so if we can kind of fund programs that create that kind of hope, at least for some people in these countries, that could go a long way. Relatedly, I think more, and I know the US government has funded some of these kinds of programs as well, sort of programs to address, to respond to the high levels of violence in a non-violent way, right? So to think about much more creative ways, especially to deal with often young men, and why do they get involved in these violent organizations? Where does that come from? And often, it's complicated, right? But I think there are programs, and we can find them elsewhere in the world, programs working with gangs in ways that give the young people who are drawn to that lifestyle a sense of dignity, a sense of possibility. So I think there are ways to do it, but it's like grains of sand. Because I think trying to fix things at the national level, I'm just not very optimistic that that's going to work. So I think we got to be in for the long game, and to be very strategic about what sort of organizations and programs be supported, to maybe think a little bit outside of the security box about how to do that, because that hasn't worked. It's proven to not work. In fact, I think it often makes the problems even worse when we focus on sort of the law and order security approach. I agree with the assessment of the problem, but I'm not sure the solution has been as well conceived as it needs to be.
On a sort of related note, you mentioned that the murder rates amongst women and girls are inordinately high. Why is that?
Well, I think this is actually part of the reason for the high levels of violence in general, and that is it's sometimes referred to as toxic masculinity. You may have heard this term, where the sort of these are societies that have a history of very machista, for lack of a better word, sort of culture, where gender relations are male-dominated, and there's been a kind of high level of tolerance for violence in domestic relations. And when you add on to that all these economic and social stresses, it's that's a volatile cocktail, right? And so I think a lot of it is some of it's domestic abuse, some of it is the way gang violence kind of happens. And there are women and girls in gangs, right? They get involved, but there are also the families of people involved. And so, for example, if someone is being extorted and they don't pay, they may be harmed, but so might their wife and their daughter, right? And the harm can be sexual as well as murder, right? So that's, I mean, I don't want to attribute it to culture. I don't think it's just, I think it's really, it's a set of structures that interact with a particular culture that lead to these very high levels of violence against both men and boys and women and girls.
Sort of a more permissive environment for that kind of behavior.
Certainly for violence in general,
You know.
yeah.
Great. Does anybody in the audience have a question? Sir?
Yeah, me?
He's bringing in the microphone.
Okay, great. Thank you. What do you think the appetite would be here in the U.S. to kind of slow down on the war on drugs? We're 50 years into it. We've seen in other parts of the world where there's been decriminalization, there have actually been positive results. And it might, in our own case, even back with alcohol in the 20s and 30s, we've seen a de-escalation in violence when we ended that war. Might it be something that we can try, since we're decades into it and it's not really achieving what it was supposed to?
Yeah, another incredibly complicated issue. Well, I mean, I think we've already done it with marijuana, you know, more or less. On these harder drugs, it's a hard sell. I think a potentially more productive way to go would be to, and this is also a hard sell in the United States, but I think would be easier than the decriminalization route, would be this is a public health issue route. And we've seen this somewhat with the opioid crisis, where it's been more defined as a public health challenge. I would still say it's not sufficiently so. So I would say that's the most politically feasible way to go, and I actually think would be quite helpful, right? To rethink this less as a law and order security issue and more as a public health issue. And that also kind of shifts the focus from the supply to the demand. Because without the demand, you know, the supply isn't gonna show up, right? And yet we've constantly been, partly because it's more convenient, right, focused on stop the supply, and then people won't be able to get it. But what happens is they can get it, they just have to pay more, take more risk, there's more violence. Frankly, I think it's similar for migration, to be honest. So I think trying to stop it at the source has been proven not to be very effective. And so we need to think more about why is there demand for drugs, and how can we address that, and to treat it as a public health problem to the extent that it is. A little bit of recreational use, maybe that's fine, but it is much more of a public health challenge, certainly in this country, than just about recreational use.
I can build off of that answer by posing a question that has to do with the fact that you're looking at a part of the world, and we've heard about all the horrible things that are happening and the difficult task that lies ahead to try and correct any of that. What would you do if you took the 7 most successful countries in the last 50 years that have come from third world to first world, you know, the South Koreas, the Hong Kongs, the Chinas, the Indias, if you can find in those countries the attributes that they were able to successfully employ that enabled them to emerge out of that muck and mire of the third world into the first, how would you apply that to the countries that you study, and do you see that as one way of getting those countries to participate in and actually lend credence to and support to these kinds of evolutionary steps that have taken over these last 50 years?
Yeah, well, let me first say, I don't want to overstate the muck and mire. These are amazing countries. The people are incredible. They have rich cultures. So I don't want to suggest that there's nothing redeeming about these places at all. However, they have these serious challenges. And so to answer your question about, are there lessons from other places that have been more successful in terms of generating sustainable economic development? I think a big one, but you know, the politics get in the way, is the distribution of wealth. it was a huge advantage that countries like Korea, Taiwan, the East Asian countries had, is for various historical reasons. They started their sort of industrialization with much more equitable distribution of wealth. They didn't have these huge landowners who controlled a significant share of the land and wealth in their country. And so they started off in a much better place. Now, once you have highly inequitable distribution of wealth, it's very difficult to undo that, right? Because they're very powerful interests who don't want it to be undone. There are economic costs to undoing it, right? As we've seen with efforts at land reform or other kind of redistributive policies, it can wreak havoc on the economy as well as creating a huge political backlash. So the problem, I think, is how do you get from here to there? Because I do think that a reasonable, I'm not saying equality, but a sort of reasonable distribution of wealth that means there's upward mobility, there's a chance for upward mobility for people, is the foundation for a sustainable growth model. And I think history has borne that out in the places that have been able to produce that kind of sustainable growth. There's also an institutional answer, right? The countries that have been most successful in generating sustainable growth and therefore becoming wealthy countries have had, for various, again, sort of historical, complicated reasons, have had either institutions that functioned reasonably well, they had capable states, they had capable bureaucracies, or they had a kind of unity amongst the people where people, if they were asked to sacrifice for their country, were willing to do it, right? And so this goes back to kind of different colonial legacies, different histories of kind of how their states were formed, how their bureaucracies were created. So again, the challenge is, if you're a country who didn't have those advantages, how do you get from here to there? And that's what none of us has been able to figure out, unfortunately. I mean, I'd have a Nobel Prize if I could figure it out. And so again, I think we have to maybe unpack it and start at the local level and find sort of creative alternatives, and then think about, are there ways to scale those up?
Are you familiar with the Alaskan Native Land Reclamation Act of '71 and the establishment of the tribal corporation?
Very vaguely.
Take a look at that. That's something I am trying to apply in Africa, but the same issues apply in Africa that are where you're talking about.
Interesting. I'll look it up.
Tim, do you have any questions from the online folks?
Here, Larry, can I have the mic?
So the first question to come in online is from Joseph in Epping, and the gist of his question is, what can we learn from Belize and their success in maintaining their democracy throughout a region that has seen a lot of democratic backsliding over the past 20, 30 years?
I wish I could answer that question better. Belize is it's one of the most understudied countries in Latin America. I know very little about it. In fact, I decided I should look this up before I come here today. Did they have a transition to democracy? So they were a British colony. They were previously known as British Honduras. And from what I understand, a democratic system of government, although not a fully autonomous one, was set up before they were made independent from Britain. And then when they gained their independence, they maintained that same system of government. And so they have I think it's a parliamentary system of government, which is very unusual in Latin America. Most of the Latin American systems are modeled after the US, the presidential systems. They're English speaking, so they're not Spanish or Portuguese or Haitian Creole speaking like the rest of the region. My answer is I don't know how they've managed, particularly since if you noticed in that violence chart, they're at the top. They have very high homicide rates. They have very serious issues with corruption and drug trafficking, and yet, they haven't had the kind of regime breakdown that we've seen in their neighboring countries. They're much more like the English-speaking Caribbean, which also has more long-standing democratic governments in the midst of lots of corruption. Jamaica, for example, which has very high rates of violence. Trinidad and Tobago, other countries in the Caribbean that have done better on the regime side, but have many of the same struggles in some of these other areas. So it's a really good question, and we should be studying it more as social scientists, because it does pose a very interesting puzzle. I have a better answer for Costa Rica, but for Belize, that's sort of the best I can do at this point.
Well, then let's go to Costa Rica. What can we learn from them to potentially help this region prevent further backsliding and hopefully recover?
Well, again, I'm going to annoy everyone and say it's all about history. But Costa Rica made some what turned out to be very wise choices. And they had the opportunity to do so, but they made some very wise choices back in the 30s, 40s. One was they decided to get rid of their army. Which, if you think about what happened to their neighbors, the militaries have been implicated in a lot of the repression and sort of backing of highly concentrated wealth, et cetera, in neighboring countries. Costa Rica they have police, so they have law enforcement, but they got rid of their military. And so the leaders of the country didn't have to deal with a military sort of chomping at the bit to intervene in politics. So that's one thing. Another thing is they very early on invested in creating a small welfare state, right? So they invested in education, kind of a la East Asian countries, who did the same, invested in human capital. So in education, in healthcare, and so, which then kind of it provides your democracy with more of a support system, because people are more or less taken care of, and so that they can engage more easily in democratic politics, and it creates less volatility within the political system. So those were two just smart choices that their leaders made a number of decades ago. And then I think the other thing is Costa Rica is invested a lot in its environment and in ecotourism. It's been very smart on the economic front as well, attracting high-tech industry to Costa Rica, emphasizing ecotourism, investing in its sort of preserving its environment. So even with that sound foundation, they could have gone in the wrong direction, but they seem to have been able to govern fairly well. They're under a lot of stress right now because they're in a really tough neighborhood. I'm really lucky to have as one of my colleagues at the Fletcher School the former president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado, and it's been really interesting. He just arrived in September. It's been very interesting to talk to him and hear his perspective on his own country. But Costa Rica is also a real outlier, especially given the neighborhood that it's in. It's done remarkably well. So.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Tim, did you have?
Yep. We've got plenty online, but if there's
Anybody
one in the room,
else have a question here from the audience?
Nope. Okay. So Cal from Fresno asks, what can the U.S. do to help some of these countries in their effort to against democratic backsliding, and is it in the U.S. interest to help? And if so, why?
All right, well, I'm going to take the second one because I think I failed to answer the first one already. I think it's very much in our interest to have democratic neighbors. Well, Mexico is a whole other thing because they're a large country and they're right next to us, right? They literally are our neighbors. But I think even for the smaller countries of Central America, democracies don't always, democracies it's a messy way to run your country. We see that here, right? It's not necessarily very efficient, doesn't always deliver what people want. So that, it's not the perfect system of government, but there is a higher chance that those who have power will be responsive to the citizenry, that they will deliver positive results to the population, and that they won't, by the other side of the coin, sort of act repressively and violate people's human rights and basically create a situation in which people have no choice but to flee. engage in these sort of corrupt deals with criminal actors. So I think the level of criminality and repression is not completely correlated with the type of regime. We've seen enough of it in somewhat democratic regimes. But I think the more you move in an authoritarian direction, the more susceptible the region is. And then I also think they tend not to be terribly sustainable, right? The Mexican system was unusual in that it lasted for 70 years, but I think it's partly because it was not that repressive and it was based on elections. However, predetermined they were. Whereas in Central America and in the rest, a lot of South America, you had a lot of back and forth political volatility, and that's not good for the U.S. interests either, right? Having a very unstable region that's also repressive and with high levels of criminality. So I think if we can help the region develop better democracy, not just electoral democracy, but meaningful democracy, where people's rights are respected, where they have opportunities, where they have a voice, that's in our interest. In addition to being, I think, sort of the right thing to do, I think it's in our own national self-interest as well.
Great, I thank you. I think that's about the end of our time, but this has been very, very interesting and informative, and I appreciate your taking the time to come and join us.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.